So of course, in freely improvised music, you can use more conventional, so to speak, things like pitch and rhythm to make your musical phrases or musical works. It doesn't all have to be this kind of timbral, noisy, strange sounds. So I've been playing a lot with people like Scott Tinkler, Anthony Pateras, Jon Rodgers, who all have developed various kinds of strategies for playing with pitch and rhythm. And especially people like Jon Rodgers, people he worked with, Anthony Burr, Ken Eadie, later on Mark Hannaford, the pianist, who come from both jazz and classical backgrounds. They were very interested in the rhythmic and harmonic language of the composer Elliott Carter, who writes purely notated music, but these people were interested in how to translate some of those ideas into an improvised language. So I've taken some of those ideas again as well when I play more pitch and rhythm based improvisations. So really what Carter did was use a lot of what are called 12-tone all-interval chords, which are chords with 12 tones and also all the 12 intervals from a minor second to a major seventh within the octave. So all the 12 intervals within the octave. So this is a very technical kind of idea. It's a form of, or it's another form of set of ideas that serialism uses as well. Serialism being a way of organizing musical materials according to very mathematical principles. Some of you may have heard of this kind of composition. Arnold Schoenberg is seen as the inventor of serialism, or certainly 12-tone music. And you can use those principles in rhythm as well, in finding patterns that then you use to invert or transpose to playing retrograde, so back to front. So kind of using more abstract ways of ordering materials that you can improvise with. Of course, when you're improvising, no one is policing whether you're doing things correctly. So it's more, again, about practicing these materials at home. And then when it comes to a performance, you have a certain toolkit that you can use for this kind of, I would call, atonal improvisation. On the rhythmic front, there are things like polyrhythms, which are very interesting to explore, metric modulations. So polyrhythms are setting two different rhythms or rhythmic pulse groups or units against each other, two or more, really. So many rhythms together. So things like 4 against 3, 4 against 5, 5 against 3. You can put any kind of pulse group against another pulse group. And these are very good exercises to do in any case for your musicianship. And also very important if you're playing contemporary music in the classical music tradition. Composers, especially after 1960s, used a lot of tricky rhythmic materials where if you've got your different kinds of polyrhythmic groupings under control, become much easier. So very simple things are, 3 against 4. And of course you can use, extend from that to any number of rhythmic groupings, always with the principle that you're subdividing in one pulse group and then you're accenting, for instance, if I'm thinking semiquavers, I'm accenting every 4 semiquavers in one hand and every 3 semiquavers in the other hand. For pianists, it's very easy to practice, for instance, just playing one note in each hand in those different rhythmic groupings. And then you can start thinking about things like metric modulations, where you're thinking in 4s, and then suddenly you start thinking in 3s. And when you're thinking in 3s, you start to play a grouping of 4 over that 3, etc. So if I'm thinking takadina, 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 takita, 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 takadina, 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 takita, 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 takadina, takadina, takadina. So I've metrically modulated from thinking in 4, pulse groups of 4, going to thinking with the same pulse, thinking in groups of 3, and then taking the group of 3 and superimposing 4 over that, and then metrically modulating back. So exercises like that are really useful just as basic musicianship training. Just like a lot of the atonal principles of pitch collections, like the all interval chords, they're great ear training as well in the pitch domain. So whether you are going to use these elements or materials or not in any performances, they're really great exercises to make you a better musician. So I'll just play a little bit using some of those ideas in a free way, but hopefully it will sound like it makes sense. So that's just a little rhapsody where I'm using some of those pitch and rhythmic ideas that I talked about. Of course, I'm using them very freely. I didn't have any particular structure in mind. It was more that I was using those techniques or that vocabulary and combining that in a free way. And even in this kind of quite artificial situation where there's no audience really, live audience, I'm not playing with anyone else, I feel like I'm having a dialogue with those techniques or those elements, materials that I talked about. So really there's a kind of push and pull between musical intention, what I want to do, and the things that are happening both technically and in the room acoustically. So really through this kind of improvising process, I can have ideas that I've developed in my practice room, and I put them into practice in the live situation, which is not always I'm not in complete control of. And mistakes, of course, don't matter when you're improvising. There isn't such a thing as a mistake, which is the beauty of it, which means that I can extemporize depending on how I'm feeling, what things are working, what things aren't working. If some technical things aren't working on the day, that's okay, because you can draw on the vocabulary that you've developed to say something else. If I'm trying to say 3-syllable words and they don't come out, I'll use 2-syllable words or 1-syllable words. Yay and nay is often enough. So I think with that, hopefully you get a few different approaches that you can use on different instruments and for different purposes when it comes to improvisation. Again, as I said before, all these ideas are translatable to composition as well. Often my improvising is workshopping for my compositions, and vice versa as well. I work things abstractly on paper, and that feeds into my improvisation language as well. So I think it's a really great skill to develop, even if you don't become an improviser, but only use it as a way to become a better instrumentalist and a better musician.